Good morning, everybody. It's one of these things that we say, isn't it, at the start of every single webinar. We'll just give it a few minutes for people to filter in from the waiting room. It's 10:02, so we're about ready to go. We'll give it another few seconds and then we will crack on. I hope the weather is as fine with you all as it is with us. I'm sure it is. Okay, let's begin. Well, good morning again, everybody, and welcome to this, our webinar on startups in the travel industry. I am delighted to be joined today not only by a fine group of people, but by a fine group of companies, for we could not have put on this webinar without the fine support from both travel risk professionals, and you'll hear from Alan Pattison in a moment, and also travel trade consultancy, and you'll hear from Matt throughout the course of the morning, Matt Purser, and also Adam Pennyfather as well. We are very grateful to be supported in this endeavour by the Institute of Travel and Tourism. One of the things that we've noticed throughout the pandemic, and there's a lot to say, isn't there, about the pandemic, but one of the very positive things that we've noticed throughout this time has been the amount of people looking to get into the travel industry for various reasons. It's been really, really great to see. And this morning is meant to be there as a help, a guide, a set of useful hints and tips and things to know about being a startup in the new travel industry. So it has a very wide set of parameters. But as I say, we have an expert set of speakers here to take you through it. So without any further delay, other than the needed house rules, which are simply this. This webinar is being recorded. Please bear that in mind. We do encourage you to collect and ask questions, and we've had a few submitted beforehand, which we will tackle at the end. We've got a very busy agenda today, so rather than tackle questions as they come up, we will save them to the end. If you do have a question which you'd like to put to any of the speakers today, then please feel free to submit it via the chat function on Zoom, which you should see. If there is a button at the bottom which says chat, if you click that, it will bring up the chat panel to the right hand side of your screen if you have it set up in the classic traditional way. If you wish to ask a question and you don't mind the rest of the group seeing it, then just use the normal chat function. It will say to everyone and everyone will see the question. If you would like to ask a more private question, then by all means choose my name from that little drop down list where it currently says everyone. Send me a private message and I will make sure that the question is asked at the Q&A at the end in a way which means that your name and your company is not revealed. And that's that. So let's move on. Our first speaker today is a fellow partner of mine here at Traveller, Ami Naru. Ami is also our head of employment, and it stands to reason that when you are looking at putting a new startup together or looking to continue where you are with a new startup, employment issues are going to be first and foremost in your mind. Is that right, Ami?
Oh, without a doubt, Matt. I think it's fair to say that in most of schoolboy error, I was on mute. Yeah, it goes without saying, Matt, that once a business is established, most of them are nothing without the people that work within those organisations, and so people are really keen. We need to get this right from the outset. So I thought I'd just spend 5 or so minutes talking about the things that new startups need to think about in terms of their staff, because very quickly these are going to be quite key considerations. So if we just turn to the next slide, please. So what do we need to do? We need to decide whether you're going to run this business by yourself initially, and that may be for a few months or a while until it gets established. You might need outside help, and then therefore the question is, how do you engage these individuals? Do you want them on your books and they're your employees, in which case there are additional obligations that you need to fulfill? Or do you not have that certainty of work yet and the certainty of income coming in to be able to pay them, in which case you might want to have them as workers, or indeed you may want to engage with consultants on a self-employed basis. So There are different means by which you can tap into additional manpower. It's not always that they are your employees. If you are going to take employees on, then you need to make sure that whether they are an employee or a worker, from day one, there is a new right that was introduced on the 6th of April 2020. It largely came in quite quietly because obviously we were in the midst of trying to deal with the pandemic then. And that's a day one right to Section 1, terms and conditions of employment. Now, you're probably thinking, what are they? They are your usual things: hours of play, place of work, who your employer is. My advice is, if you're going to go to the extent of putting that into writing, which you're obliged to do so, you should probably wrap it up in a proper contract of employment, which will give you additional protection in terms of adding in things like restrictive covenants. Because the last thing you want is someone coming in thinking, oh, do you know what, this is a brilliant idea, they're not quite established yet, I'm going to leave and set up by myself. Similarly, protect your intellectual property in those contracts of employment. Also, I'm not going to talk too much about directors, but if you are the only director, or there's you and a couple of others, you need proper directors' service agreements, and you need to understand what your obligations are under the Companies Act, and Emma will delve into that into a little bit more detail. The next thing is, I've put there, check that you can afford to take the staff on. So whether that is, as a worker or as an employee, irrelevant of how big or small you are, you still have to comply with your obligations under the national minimum wage. Currently, it's £8.91 for staff over the age of 23, which is what we call the national living wage. That age requirement was brought down from 25 to 23 earlier this year. You've got to make sure your workplace is safe and accessible for employees. So the usual health and safety obligations that you have, irrelevant of size. Also, equality and diversity is very much at the forefront, and you need to think about that in terms of incorporation into a policy. As soon as you decide to employ somebody, you need to register with HMRC. That registration can take up to 5 days. And it may be that you think, well, do you know what, I'm going to be the only person employed by this company. If you as a director are paying yourself a salary, that has to be done by payroll, in which case you have to set it up via HMRC. If you're a director and you're thinking, well, do you know what, I'll just work for nothing and I'll pay myself a dividend down the line, then you won't necessarily be going via payroll, in which case that immediate need isn't there. Also, if you are employing staff, there may be obligations in terms of auto enrolment and workplace pensions. So I won't go into too much detail because there's plenty of guidance on the government's website, but effectively, if you've got someone who's earning more than 10 grand a year, is aged over 22, and normally works in the UK, then they have the right to be auto enrolled. So you need to think about that, because there is an additional cost to you as a business. As soon as prior to employing anybody, you must have employer's liability insurance in place. It's got to be for a minimum value of £5 million and authorised by an authorised insurer. There are a list of authorised insurers on the government's website. There are penalties, and I need to point these out, that even from the first day of employment, if you haven't got this employer's liability insurance in place, you can be fined £2,500 if you're not properly insured, and you can also be fined an additional £1,000 if you don't have that employer liability certificate of insurance on display in your workplace. And once you've got through these initial building blocks and considerations, you're going to pretty much have the steps in place to continue to recruit and employ staff. And as you grow, I think it's important to keep an eye on making sure that you've got the right contracts in place and the right policies in place. So that's all I really want to say about getting ready to employ staff. And I'll hand back over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Ami. I mean, one of the problems that we have today is just fitting everything in, because I know that there is so much to say on all of the topics, and I know that Ami could quite happily talk in a good way for hours and hours on the many, many issues, because they're so important. But nevertheless, we will move on. Next up to talk us through issues with corporate governance and intellectual property considerations is Emma. Emma Shakespeare is one of our senior associates and heads up our commercial and corporate governance team. Good morning, Emma.
Good morning, Matt. Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's really good to be here. So I'm going to talk to you this morning. If you want to just flip on to the next slide, Matt. I'm going to talk to you about some of the corporate governance issues that startups will face. And I think talking about startups, that's whether it's an entirely new business or is a new division or a new subsidiary of an existing business which is looking to expand. I think it's worth pointing out that every business is different. There's no kind of one fits all approach, whether you're just at the initial idea stage or whether you've prepared a really detailed business plan. Hopefully some of the following things that I'm going to talk about will be quite useful. I think obviously the first thing that I'm going to talk about is just scoping out the proposition. So making sure, and I think this is really critical, that you think about and understand what the business is going to do and in what capacity that business will operate. So in the travel industry, this often means that that's either being an agent or a tour operator, or it could be that you're a provider of services in a B2B context, or it could be that perhaps you're going to operate a new platform, a booking or technology platform. It's important to understand where the startup will sit in the supply chain and distinguish between the different statuses, because legally they mean very different things. And that's quite key to understanding the extent to which you'll have freedom to negotiate and impose contractual terms. And Amanda's going to talk through some of the contractual documentation that startups will be needing to have a look at. So in the travel industry, it's worth pointing out that you might be aware B2C sales are more heavily regulated than B2B sales. And the combination of different travel services that you will offer will also determine the regulatory landscape that your business will sit in. So as many of you might know, combining different travel services into packages or linked travel arrangements will bring you within scope of the package travel regulations. And this imposes a number of obligations on you, including to have financial protection in place, which others will also cover today in today's talk. But importantly as well, being responsible for the travel services that are being provided, even where those are being provided by third parties. If you offer flights for sale, then obviously you'll either need to have an ATOL or you'll need to meet the criteria for the ATOL exemptions. So it's really important to understand that, because even where you're not offering a package or a linked travel arrangement, if you're selling travel products to consumers, single service, then you'll need to comply with the consumer protection legislation as well. So I think it's really good at the outset to get a really good grip and understanding on what your business proposition is, where it sits legally and where it sits in the supply chain as well. One of the points you'll also need to think about, because obviously travel is global, is who are you going to be selling to and who are your main markets? So if you're just selling into the UK, then you just need to seek UK legal advice. But if you're selling into other jurisdictions and markets, then you may need local law advice. And that's something that we can also help you with. Scoping out the proposition, I would say also it's really important when you're talking to people about your business to make sure that you've got a confidentiality agreement or an NDA in place to protect the information that you're sharing and to protect your ideas as well that you've got about your business. If you're going to be going into business with other individuals, other shareholders, other investors, then it's certainly worth as well spending some time on a heads of terms document. This will set out what the kind of key understandings between the parties are and what you're both going to bring to the business proposition. And it's definitely worth going through that at the earlier stage to make sure that everybody is aligned. You'll also need to think about the corporate structure of the new business. So often it's quite common that people will choose a limited company and will incorporate either a new company or a new subsidiary if it's a new business. And obviously the rationale for that is that it ring fences those liabilities. So if you set up a corporate vehicle and trade through that, then you are protected in terms of your personal liability. Ordinarily, you shouldn't be personally liable for the risks or debts of the business. But obviously, I'll talk a little bit about funding in due course, but that's unless you give a personal guarantee. Depending on the markets that you sell into, you may also want to consider whether you should be establishing a presence and setting up a company in other jurisdictions. And again, we can provide some further advice on that separately, and there'll also be tax and accounting issues to consider there. Moving on to key individuals, it's really important to decide what key roles individuals will play in the business and to make sure that you've got the proper contracts in place with them. So anybody who's going to be involved as a director of the business, whether that's an executive director who works full-time in the business or a non-executive director who performs more of an advisory role, then they should definitely sign a director's service contract. They'll also need to understand, and perhaps you may want to provide training on what it means and what their duties are under the Companies Act. You should also consider to what extent any directors can be involved in other businesses, and that's something that's quite often clearly set out in a director's service agreement. Often, shareholders and directors can be the same people. And if that's the case, you need to think about what happens if a shareholder ceases to be a director or an employee of the business. Can they still hold shares, or should that trigger a transfer of their shares? And if so, at what price? If they're different people, then it's important that everybody knows what decisions can be made by directors and what matters must go to shareholders for approval. And usually this is set out in the relevant agreements. If there's more than one shareholder, it's really important that you have a shareholders agreement. This is the critical document that governs the relationship between the owners of the business. The relationship will depend on whether you're equal shareholders, whether one has a majority and one has a minority, and what the long-term objectives of everybody involved in the business is. And something which may seem really inappropriate to discuss at the outset of a new venture is exit strategy, but it's something that's vitally important. If a shareholder wants to leave the business, will the others have a right of first refusal on their shares? What if you receive an offer for the business from a third party? Can one shareholder drag another along? And similarly to thinking about whether directors can invest or work in other businesses, the same thought needs to be given to shareholders. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Matt? I'm also going to talk a little bit about funding, and I think here it's important to think about not just the initial funding, but also what future funding might be needed once you've kind of done the initial launch of the business. And quite often a shareholders agreement will set out kind of what the principles are around funding and what the parties' expectations are. So obviously you need to think about where funding will come from, whether it'll take the form of debts or whether it'll take the form in equity, and you will give people a share of the business in exchange for some investment. Obviously, debt finance might seem attractive because you'll retain full ownership and control of the business, and particularly if you're operating through a separate corporate vehicle. However, a lender's likely to ask for security over the business and even a personal guarantee. And the loan agreement itself may impose restrictions on the business or require you to seek lender consent for certain activities. So, for example, a loan agreement may restrict profits from being taken out of the business whilst any debt remains outstanding. And if you'll be combining finance through third-party funding and personal investments, it's very likely that third-party lenders will require their loans and any security to take priority over personal investments. So again, that's just a risk and something that you would need to be aware of. So I think it's really important to understand how the business is obviously going to be funded, and importantly to look at those documents and make sure that you understand what the key terms and what any restrictions are and what control investors or lenders could have over the business. Finally, I'm just going to touch on kind of protecting your key assets and managing and mitigating risks. So I think it's really important to think about where your startup's value lies, what distinguishes it from competitors, what your key assets are, and how do you protect those. Often, aside from the people, this will be your brand and technology. And I would say that in addition to kind of obtaining the corporate name, the company name in respect of your brand and any domain names, I'd certainly recommend that you consider applying for a trademark. So trademarks are granted for particular countries and jurisdictions, and they give you a monopoly right to use that brand or name in those jurisdictions against certain categories, and the categories are often linked to business sectors. So in relation to travel, you'd be looking at kind of travel, leisure, hospitality, that kind of thing. Ideally, you should seek to register your brand not only in the territories that you'll be selling into, so the markets that you'll be selling into, but also the areas where those travel services will be provided. So you've got ultimate protection. And in terms of technology, obviously you will need technology to set up your business. And I think quite often in the travel sector, that is kind of sales and branding platforms and booking platforms. So if you're going to be licensing third-party technology and it's going to be critical to your business, then obviously it's really important to ensure that the license terms are fit for purpose and suitable for your needs. And again, thinking long term, make sure that there aren't any provisions in that license agreement which would mean that a change of ownership of your business could trigger a termination right. Quite often, these provisions can kind of be hidden away in the boilerplate, but it's quite significant for a business whose key asset can be technology. Some businesses will develop their own IT, their own platforms, their own technology. And if that's the case, whether that's been done in-house or whether you're using kind of third parties and consultants to do that, again, it's critical to make sure that you've got agreements in place that make sure that the IP in those agreements, in those technologies, is owned by the company and not by those individuals personally. So there is quite a bit to think about. Hopefully, I've given a bit of an overview of the things that you need to be thinking about at the outset and having a good grasp on. But that's it for me for the moment, and I'll hand back to Matt.
Thank you, Emma. And yeah, one of the points you make there, very similar to one of the points that Ami made, which is we know that new startups in particular spend so much time and effort and blood and sweat and tears creating these companies, and then having the right protections in place is so important. And just one of the points that you make there, Emma, is that you put so much time into the brand, and then having that protection of the brand is so important. The last thing you want is someone trying to trade on that or to take away some of the good work that you've done. Okay, good stuff. Something else that is also very important, and we say this a lot as law firms, don't we, Amanda, but the importance of contracts in particular, which underpin so much of what we do. So Amanda Firth is one of our associate solicitors here and is going to take us through the walk that is key documents for travel businesses. Good morning, Amanda.
Good morning, all. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so I work in the corporate governance and commercial team here at Travelaw, and I'm here to give you a whistle-stop tour of commercial contracts today. So hold on to your hat because it's going to be at quite a speed. So Dave, if you could move on to my first slide, please. Thank you very much. So first of all, I thought a good place to start would be the reasons why you as a fledgling travel business will actually want to put these commercial contracts in place. There's going to be various different types that you'll need to govern the various different relationships that you'll have, but the reasons for having them are broadly similar, and I've put the key ones up here. So firstly, these are going to be the terms that set out how you do business with various different parties. And so you need to make sure that you have clarity and certainty as to what those terms actually are. If there's ever a disagreement down the line, then you don't want to be left scrabbling to look through your emails to find a kind of a trail between you, or looking to, have a debate with someone about what you agreed verbally. What you want is a written contract which actually sets out those terms and that you can point to. So secondly, and very importantly, commercial contracts provide you with protection. It will vary depending on what type of contract it is, but they're going to cover important terms such as cancellation and refund. They might contain a limitation on your liability, which you're going to want to rely on, or it might be that there's an indemnity in there that you're going to want to rely on to recover from one of your suppliers. And so ultimately, if someone's making a claim against you, or if you're looking to make a claim against someone else, then the protection lies in the documents, and that's going to be the first thing that we look at for you. And then finally, they're going to cover off your legal obligations. As you'll have discovered by now, the world of travel is a highly regulated one, and a key part of your compliance will be contained within the appropriate terms in your commercial contracts. And so those are kind of your main reasons for having them. And I wanted to take you through what I would class at this stage, where you are in terms of starting out or not been trading for such a long time, the ones that I would class as absolutely of utmost importance. So Dave, if you could move on please to my next slide. I've just listed here each of the key documents which I'm going to chat through with you today. So we've got your booking conditions, which is the term that you use where you tend to be selling to consumers, or if you are in a business-to-business capacity, then it's your terms and conditions. Supplier agreement, in the context today, I mean where you are purchasing travel services from a third party. You might have an agency agreement. It might be that you're acting as an agent for a third party, or that you're appointing agents yourself, in which case you'll be wanting an agency agreement. You're definitely going to need a privacy policy, which looks at how you're going to deal in personal data. And then finally, at the end, I'll come to look at some documents, which I wouldn't say you absolutely have to have these at the point of launch, but there's reasons why you'll want them. And so I'll whistle through those as well. So if you could move on to the next slide for me, please, Dave. The first thing that I mentioned was the booking conditions, or your terms and conditions. And so this is going to be the basis of your contract with your client. First of all, it's going to set out how you act. I'm talking about in a consumer context at this point. And so it might be that you're acting as an agent, and so you're just putting clients into contracts with third parties. It might be that you're acting as a principal, in which case you have the contract directly with your client, or it might be that you're acting in both, depending upon the circumstances. But the obligations upon you are very different depending on what capacity you're acting in. And so you need a set of booking conditions, which very clearly sets that out and sets out your liability accordingly. Then they'll also set out customer rights, but more importantly than that for you, they also provide protection for your business. As I mentioned on the previous slide, one of the key reasons for having a commercial contract in place in the first place. So if you have a good set of booking conditions, then where possible, you'll be looking to limit your liability, certainly in respect of certain types of loss, so that in the event that a claim comes in, you kind of your exposure is as limited as possible. And then finally, again, your terms are going to be a key part of proving that you comply with your legal obligations. So if you're selling packages, for example, there's all kinds of things in the package travel regulations which stipulate certain terms that must be in your booking conditions. Failure to do so can be a criminal offence. Alternatively, even if you're not selling packages, then there's certain terms that need to be in there to comply with consumer legislation. And so you need to make sure that you've got an appropriate set of terms and conditions in place. If we could just move on to the next slide. I won't cover this in any detail, but some of you will be sat there saying, well, we don't sell to consumers, we act in a business-to-business context. And so I wanted to briefly mention the different types that you might have in place there. So you might have a wholesale agreement. So you're going to use that if you're selling travel services onto companies, and then those companies are actually selling them onto consumers in their own name. You never have a contract with the consumer, but you need to have an appropriate document in place for your sale to companies. You might have a business travel agreement if you've set yourself up as a travel management company. So you're going to be acting as an agent for businesses in booking their travel services. You need to make sure you have a business travel agreement in place in those circumstances. Otherwise, you'll be classed as a package organizer and subject to consumer legislation. And then finally, if you're doing events management, then again, you need a contract in place for that sets out your normally position as an agent. So I don't have any time to go into those in any more detail. If any of them are relevant to you, then I'd say reach out afterwards, and I'd be happy to have a chat about the kind of terms that you normally expect to see in those documents. But if you could move on, please, Dave, I want to have a quick look at supplier agreements. So obviously these are going to govern the relationship that you have with your suppliers. Now, the terms I'm going to talk you through here are terms which I would say to you, you need to have in your supplier agreements. You might make a decision that you are going to contract on the terms that the supplier sends to you. Those will have some other things in there that you need, but I would say that they will be missing the key element, which is the protection for you. Unless it's a very charitable supplier, then they're going to be very supplier friendly. And so they're not going to contain the good stuff that I'm going to chat through here. So wherever possible, I would say to you, think about putting in place your own supplier agreement and trying to negotiate that with your suppliers, because that's going to give you much more protection than just signing up to whatever it is that your suppliers send you. So things I would want to put in your supplier agreement. First of all, kind of your essential details. So your things around payment, cancellation and amendment, all things that people are looking at now, obviously in the context of a pandemic. You know, you don't want to be finding that you signed up to a very supplier friendly set of terms and conditions. These are the things to think about at the time you contract with them. So you'll have some clarity on those. Secondly, I've got in there health and safety compliance. So you have an obligation to use due care and skill in choosing your suppliers. You don't want to be sending off your clients to people that aren't complying with the relevant laws. And so what you'd want in your supplier agreement is a whole list of kind of assurances from your supplier that they are complying with all the relevant laws in their country in respect to the services that they're providing. And so you want that covered off in your supplier agreement. Next, and probably most importantly of all, and which you'll never find in a supplier set of terms where they're put forward by the supplier, is an indemnity. So an indemnity is basically, it's a right for you to be able to make a claim against the supplier where you've suffered a loss as a result of their actions. To give you an example of that, you might have a contract in place with an accommodation provider, and you send off your client to a hotel where they have an accident as a result of a dodgy walkway that's negligently maintained. You might receive a claim against you from a client, but what you would want to do is then seek to rely upon an indemnity so that you can recover any losses you suffer in respect of that claim from your supplier, because it's your supplier's fault. An indemnity gives you a nice and easy way to do that. And so that's what we're looking for in a document. Hand in hand with that is insurance. It's all well and good having an indemnity, but you need to make sure that your supplier has insurance in place so that they have the assets to be able to pay out if you actually make a claim against them. So it's another key point for a supplier document. And then finally, I've mentioned data protection there. You need to have certain clauses in place with your suppliers to deal with data protection, and that's a legal requirement. So you'd cover that off in there as well. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, Dave. I've got a quick one on agency agreements. They won't be relevant to everyone, but I wanted to mention it. Whether or not you are being appointed as an agent or whether you are appointing agents yourself, you need to make sure that you've got an agency agreement in place which expressly sets out that agency appointment. Beyond that, you're going to want to put in there your details of kind of commission, invoicing and booking process, and then everything else that I've just mentioned in respect of supplier agreements from the previous slide. So it's really a whistle-stop tour on the old agency agreements. If we could move on, privacy policy. I would bet that all of you are going to need a privacy policy. You'll all be handling personal data in some respect, whether it's in respect of your clients or employees or anything else. You're going to be handling personal data, and so you need to comply with appropriate data protection legislation. The laws on this are quite prescriptive as to what you actually need to include in a privacy policy. It's all these things around kind of what data you collect, how you use it, what your legal basis is for using it, how long you're going to keep it, who you're going to pass it to, all of these things that data subjects have a right to know and that you must put in a policy. I've put up there just to kind of focus the mind, where you fail to comply with data protection laws, you can really have some issues there. So the maximum fine that they can impose, where it's a breach of UK data protection legislation, is fines of £17.5 million or up to 4% of global turnover if that's higher, which I assume for you fledgling businesses at this point would not be, but it really does make you think it's something you need to get your house in order on that point. And then finally, Dave, if we could move on to the last slide, what I've termed other key but less essential documents. These are things that I wouldn't necessarily say you absolutely need to have this at the point of launch, which is what I would say for all the rest of them. But these are things that you definitely need to have in your mind for kind of either shortly after you start, or kind of just things to think that you're going to need at some point in the future. The first on there is cookies policy. So if you have a website which uses cookies, then it is a legal requirement that you have a policy which sets out the details of such cookies. So make sure that you get one of those in place fairly sharpish. You might want to have a website terms of use, and it's not technically a legal requirement to have one, but it comes back to the point around protection for you, because it minimises the risks in respect of your website, and it protects your intellectual property rights in the content of your website. So it is definitely a good to have. And then I've popped up there as well, you might want to have an acknowledgement of risk form or a parental consent form. Not everyone's going to need these or want these, but if you're dealing in travel which is particularly risky, or which is made available to minors without parents present, then you might think that this is actually something that you want to investigate. And so I can draw a breath, having rushed through an awful lot there. Those are kind of the main documents that you're going to be thinking about when you're kind of starting out with your business. It will depend entirely upon how you trade as to what you need. And so I would encourage you, if you want to get in touch with us, we can have a chat with you about what you actually need and a bit more detail about that. And that's all I wanted to say. So thanks, over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Amanda. Expertly done. And as Amanda has said, and as we've said this morning, there is a lot here. There is an awful lot to get through, and we're only really touching the edges, but hopefully that's all been very useful. Certainly the sessions so far have been chock full of good information, and it doesn't stop there. One of the questions that we're often asked about, especially from new startups, is, do I need insurance? If so, where can I go to get insurance? And as a law firm, there's a lot we can do, but that isn't one of them. And at that point, what we usually do is to give people the contact of good people who know their stuff, know what they are talking about, and are usually happy to chat. And that brings me on nicely to Alan Pattison from Travel and Risk Professionals. Good morning, Alan. He is here. I've seen him. Well, as Alan, is he on the, he's still on the call? I don't think he is. It doesn't look like he's showing, so he maybe dropped connection. Okay, what we'll do is, whilst Alan comes back with us, we may shift things around ever so slightly. And Matt, are you in a position to pick up at this stage? Yeah, okay, well, in which case, let me instead, for now, introduce Matt Purser from the Travel Trade Consultancy. I know, Matt, you are joined here today as well with Adam, who will join us later on. Rather than me introduce you, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us all about you and TTC.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Purser. I am one of the directors at Travel Trade Consultancy. As Matt mentioned, I am going to be joined later by my colleague, Adam Pennyfather. So any questions you do have, feel free to ask, and we'll try and help you out. Travel Trade Consultancy is in its 17th year now, just gone past its 16th birthday. So we've been trading since 2005, where we provide lots of help and advice to travel companies, so startups and long established businesses as well, around lots of subjects, including the travel regulations. But what I'll do is I'll share my screen and we'll go through some of the other bits that we help out with, and we'll talk about some of the things probably you should be considering if you're considering starting up a new travel business. So I'm just going to share my screen here. So you should be able to see that now. So we're going to cover off a few different areas here, and I guess similar to the presentations that we've seen so far from Travelaw, we won't be able to go into a huge amount of detail because there is so much to cover off, but hopefully it gives you some food for thoughts. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. So the first thing I just wanted to cover off really was around whether now was a good time to start a travel business. I guess historically we see lots of barriers to entry there, and some of them I've listed down there. Some of the things we see, and I guess if you speak to some people, considering the current times we're living in terms of a pandemic and travel being so restricted, people may question why you're starting a travel business. But actually, I think some of those barriers to entry now prove advantageous to a startup. A lot of those, one of the big ones there is around the brand identity, which I know Travelor touched upon earlier about protecting that. But lots of travel businesses have built up a brand, a reputation over a number of years, and that has a huge amount of value. And as a new business coming into the market, sometimes it's very difficult to break down that and join into that market where it's already so competitive. Well, a lot of those brands obviously have been on hold for 18 months. So a lot of that brand loyalty, the loyalty of customers they've had before has actually diminished, not necessarily because they've treated their customers badly, but because people haven't been able to travel. So that is probably one that is not as powerful as it has been in the past. I think the financial strength one I've got there around the third one. A lot of you probably would have read around travel companies having to issue refund credit notes, which essentially is a credit to the customer, money they owe to the customer. Some of them have had to take on CBILS or bounce back loans from the government scheme. So actually starting a travel business with none of that historic debt that some of those have, again, might prove advantageous to a startup in these times. So there's some other ones there as well, and obviously we can go into some more detail on the Q&A, or feel free to contact us afterwards. The second point I really wanted to make really was around preparation. We do receive a lot of calls and inquiries from businesses who are thinking of starting up a travel company, and you'll see some real range of businesses in there of those that have really done lots of research around the product they want to sell. They're very passionate about it. They have a very clear plan of what the product is that they want to sell, what suppliers they're going to use, how they're going to put that together, and the type of customers that will fit their demographic, fit their product. But we also see the other side of it, where people know they want to start a travel business. They are passionate about travel, but not really sure who they're going to use as a supplier, what destinations they're going to go to, not sure whether they need a license or not, and therefore are unable to answer the questions there around, are you adequately funded? Because they're not quite sure what it is they need. So do spend that time on the preparation. The regulators, everyone in the chain really is going to want to see that you thought properly around your business plan. So please do make sure that it's fully prepared before you're ready to launch. I touched upon there around some of the licenses. There are, with the pandemic, that is an ever-changing market at the moment around how you can financially protect what is perceived by customers to be the best way, what is perceived to be the best way by suppliers within the industry, and also what is available actually from the market. We've seen sort of insurers' appetite wane a bit because of the pandemic. We've seen lots of talk around trust accounts, but there are the package travel and linked travel arrangements 2018 that we have to comply with in the UK. Alongside that are the ATOL regulations. So if you're looking to do flights alongside any packages, you need to take those two into account. And what they essentially do is give you a choice of how you're going to financially protect your clients, and that could be with a bond. So a bond essentially is a promise from a bank or insurance company to pay out a sum of money to a trade body who would then refund customers. The second way is through insurance. So an insurance policy, again taken out by the tour operator, around protecting your clients again. And the third one is around trust accounts, where the money paid from clients goes into a trust account and is allowed to leave under certain circumstances. But the default on that is that money shouldn't leave the trust until after the completion of the trip. So there are 3 different models in which you can comply. There's not a one size fits all, so I can't sit here and say this is the best one, best route, because it really depends on your business model, of which one is best for you. Some of them may not be available to you depending on the type of product or how well funded you are. So do some research around that as well, to make sure that you've fully thought through the one that you're going to use and it's going to work for your model. For example, if you want to go down the route of a trust account, but all of your suppliers want paying as soon as a booking is made, maybe that trust account is not going to work for you because that money is sitting in a separate account. So do consider that as well. And then that sort of leads on to merchant acquirers in terms of you being able to take bookings by card and payments by card. So they will certainly require you to have some level of financial protection in place. Not all of them give the same protection to the merchant acquirer. So if the tour operator was to cease trading, will the customer be asked to get their money back from their credit card company, or will the financial protection itself give a refund to the client? So they're all things that you need to take into account. So again, don't choose your financial security for your clients just on the basis that it's maybe the cheapest option for you, because if it's a solution that means you can't end up getting a merchant facility in order to take credit cards, then that's not going to help your business. So do consider all of these before you make your final decision. And obviously the bottom one in there around the cost of it as well. There is a bit of competition within that market, but it can fluctuate quite a lot around cost as well. So consider that as well when you're looking into that facility. Raising finance. So again, that was touched upon earlier around, I think in all of the presentations really, around can you afford to take on new staff, etc. Is now a bad time for raising finance? I think we've seen a real mixed bag really of people who've been able to raise finance. I think with a lot of new businesses, we see them sort of lean on family to start with, and then if they've got some more affluent friends and family, they might lean on them to help them get their project off the ground. Bear in mind that I guess anyone that's investing ultimately wants to see a return on their investment. Some of them may not be as time sensitive as others. So private equity, for example, if you manage to attract someone from private equity into investing into your business, are probably going to want a return on their investment within a 3 to 5 year period. Friends, family may be a bit more lenient. Crowdfunding again is a way that we've seen businesses raise money recently with some success, and I guess there's less pressure then on when that money is going to be repaid. But is now a bad time? I think we're seeing again that attractiveness of businesses being debt free when they're starting up, but obviously it's very difficult to prove your concept as a travel business to a private equity firm if everything is just written within a business plan. Someone will probably want to see that the model works before they actually part with their money. So you might be better off to start with sort of the friends and family route to start with before you can then start to attract external investors into that. But yeah, we've seen investors recently over the past few weeks and months being able to raise finance still. So there's definitely a market out there and an appetite to do that. And that's really all I wanted to cover off for now. So yeah, I'll leave it there. And obviously myself and Adam will be around for the Q&A later if someone wants to delve into those subjects in a bit more detail.
Quite so. And many thanks, Matt. Again, a very broad set of issues covered expertly in a short amount of time. So thank you very much. And as Matt says, he and Adam will be available in a short amount of time for any questions that people want to raise. This is your opportunity to ask Matt and Adam. And indeed, Emma and Ami and Amanda questions, and also not forgetting Alan, who I believe we now have on the line from a faraway destination.
Yes, so terribly sorry about internet issues this morning. As always, so I've had to log everything out and come in via my phone, which is challenging with my eyesight, but there you go.
Technology issues with a video platform, it's unheard of.
Absolutely, yes. It's not my strong point. What I'm aiming to do this morning is to give you all some information on what insurances startups should be considering, some helpful hints hopefully on best practice, and also some operational hints and tips which I hope will be of use, and also to hopefully give you a bit of a grounding and more of an understanding of your risk exposure. Now ordinarily an insurance discussion with a startup for us could normally go on for an hour plus, so you'll be pleased to know I've only got a 20-minute slot, so I'm not going to subject you to anything too painful this morning. So if we can go on to the first slide if possible. Bit of information about us. We are one of a number of travel industry insurance experts in the UK. We are part of the Tasker Insurance Group, which is represented across the UK. Been going for 21 years now, and continue to expand and grow. The particular division that I run here exists solely to look after the insurance needs of the UK travel and tourism industry. We've got hundreds of clients on our books, encompassing a very broad range of risks, from small niche startups through to large nationally recognised companies, meaning that there's not much we don't insure in terms of activity and destinations, but there's always something new every week, so it keeps our feet on the ground. Post-Brexit, we're also registered as an operation in Europe as well, so we're able to look at European tour operators and also overseas offices for UK companies as well. So outside of, moving on to the next slide, outside of motor and household insurance, the realm of insurance is probably virtually unknown for a new startup into the travel sector. So I thought I'd just spend a minute or so just explaining what insurance is and also what the importance of it is. So in essence, as a tour operator, you have risk exposures, and in return for the payment of a premium to an insurance company, you are transferring that risk out of your domain and into the domain of the insurance company. So it immediately gives you peace of mind and a bit of financial security. In some cases, insurance will be a membership requirement for certain bodies. ABTA, for example, may require you to have certain levels of financial protection or liability cover. It obviously, and its bottom line, protects your business assets. So if you have a large claim made against you for an injury, for example, it means that the insurance policy will pick that up rather than you having to fund it out of your own assets and funding. Obviously, it also can have a PR benefit as well. So if we take the example of a customer making an injury claim against you, if that's swiftly, fairly and equitably settled, then chances are you're probably going to have, hopefully, a good customer experience out of that, which means potentially more return business and also a good PR benefit on social media as well. You may have customer requirements. So if you're particularly a startup dealing with the educational sector, local education authorities, schools, colleges may require you to have minimum levels of cover. In some cases, that could be 10 million public liability or higher, depending on what you're doing and what types of groups you're running. So lots of various reasons to have insurance. It can be a bit of a minefield, hence my discussion this morning. So if you look at the next slide, what I've decided to do here is to look at what an established travel company may have in place in terms of insurances. So this can be quite scary to a startup, because there's a lot of insurances there, and you're probably all thinking, crikey, that's a lot of money and premium as well. So what I'm going to try and do today is to cut through all of those, look at what's essential initially and certainly desirable, and then look to hopefully give you some focus on what you can build into your insurance portfolio as you grow as a company. So an established tour operator will certainly have professional liability, tour operator liability. It's likely to have crisis response cover, office insurance protecting its office assets. As Matt touched upon earlier, the likelihood is it will have some element of financial failure cover, either via an insurance policy or a trust account. Cyber liability and directors and officers liability. in my view, as an insurance professional, essential risk protections, massively underused in most industries, to be honest, but very important areas of risk, which I'll touch on later for you. Many companies will have staff annual travel policies, but we're sending their staff overseas, personal accident, travel disruption, terrorism. It's a wide range of insurances. But moving on to the next slide, if you're a startup, what's vital? What do you really need from the outset? Now, as a professional, I'd say you probably need as many of those as you can get, but I am cognizant that cash flow is key, certainly as a startup company. So, what should you really focus on initially? Your professional liability is definitely essential. If you're sending passengers overseas, you potentially have a rather large exposure to risk, but I'll touch on this on the next slide. Same with employers' liability. Ami touched on that earlier in her discussion. It's a legal requirement to have in place if you've got any employees, so that can't be understated, because obviously you're looking at financial penalties there. Crisis response, again, I'll deal with that shortly as well, and the importance of that as a tour operator. But outside of those, financial protection, Matt touched upon that, and I've said it already. You will need to have an element of financial protection for your consumer monies. That's legal, and it was certainly also desirable. Office insurance, if you're going to set yourself up an office, there's no point in having nice shiny new Apple Macs in your office premises if 2 days later you have a fire in the office and everything's destroyed. So work yourself out some protection for that. It's relatively cost effective and does give you peace of mind that if the worst happens, your assets are physically going to be replaced. And one thing which, as I mentioned earlier, lots of organisations, both new and established, will overlook, probably initially in favour of cost, is one of cyber insurance. This is one of the fastest growing risks faced by most industries, not just the travel industry, but one which definitely merits a lot of attention. If you've got a website, you've got an email system, you are exposed to cyber attack. And there is an inclination to think, well, I've got antivirus software, I've got firewalls, I'll be okay. I won't open up dodgy emails, I know what I'm doing. But the short of the story is, if someone wants to break into your system and they get in, the damage they can cause is incalculable, and arguably far much greater than someone just smashing in your office door and nicking your computers. If someone's in your electronics, they know your payroll, they know your suppliers, they can hold you to ransom. Financially, a cyber attack could be devastating, and definitely worth looking at in terms of insurance. The insurance itself is relatively cost effective for the cover it provides, but the principal area of protection for any company, either new or established, is the experts that a cyber insurance policy will give you. So if someone hacks into your system, sends you an email to say they're holding you to ransom, if you can call upon a range of forensic specialists, investigators, PR and media, legal professionals, these are the guys you really need to help you get out of a hole, particularly with GDPR and the potential theft of customer data. If you get the chance to consider cyber insurance, it is definitely worth the paper it's written on, and that's definitely one to consider. But I just want to spend a little bit of time now, certainly with the next slide, looking at the importance of professional liability. So if you're a tour operator, you may or may not be aware, certainly if you're a startup, that you are exposed to a wide variety of risk exposures, particularly with regards to the package travel directives. So as you'll see there for the next bullet point, if you're putting together a package holiday, you're going to be liable for the actions of your suppliers. Now, you may not be operating the hotel, cooking the food, or driving the bus, but if they are suppliers that are included in your package travel booking, you initially, at law, are liable for anything that could go wrong there. So here we're looking at food poisonings, coach crashes, air crashes. There's a huge variety of scenarios which you, as a small startup company, are exposed to. And this is where a tour operator liability, professional liability policy comes into its own and is worth its weight in gold. So definitely worth considering. You will most likely have a worldwide risk exposure. We're not the only provider of this type of cover. There are a few of us around. Worldwide cover is key because you could be sending passengers to Australia, America, the middle of Africa, wherever it may be. So you need to ensure that you've got a policy in force that will protect you should something happen anywhere in the world. And one of the main reasons for taking this policy out is really protection against third-party injury. And injury claims can be very minor, so stubbed toes, we see those all the time, the odd broken finger here and there, up to potentially catastrophic vehicle accidents, air crashes, hotel fires. We've seen all of these things, and these things could be well into the seven figures and more, particularly if you've got a relatively decent sized group of people in one particular spot. Unintentional errors and omissions, that's also a key part of tour operator liability cover. As professional as anyone is, mistakes will occur. It's human nature, we all make them, and that's what professional indemnity cover is there for, to meet claims arising from those. And as we've mentioned a few times here, if you've got any staff members, now these could be temporary bookkeepers, you could have work experience, you could have tour guides, anyone working on your behalf under a UK contract of employment, means that at law you have to have employers liability insurance in place, and that is normally an optional extra to be included in these types of policies. So I could talk for hours. I won't. You'd be pleased to know on the benefits of tour operator liability, as could most of my peers in the industry. It's absolutely essential and well worth looking at. Obviously, if anyone's got any particular questions on that, I'm happy to speak at the end or off camera at any point after that. Now, bolted on to tour operator liability insurance is certainly our policy that we have here, is crisis response. And the reason I put this in here is you can have your tour operator liability policy, that gives you protection, that's great. But what happens when a crisis occurs? Because if it occurs, invariably, this is going to be at 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning. You get the call, there's been a major hotel fire. What are you going to do? If you've never experienced a crisis before, the experience can be massively overwhelming. You could have Sky TV knocking on your door asking for comment. You could have next of kin on the phone. What you need around you when this happens, and hopefully it never will, but if it does, you need a team of crisis experts who will help you navigate through certainly the initial stages of the crisis until your liability insurance kicks in and takes over. Obviously, the benefits here are one of brand and one of consumer protection and consumer assistance. So if you can call upon translators, trauma counsellors, crisis coordinators, both in the UK and overseas, in resorts, this will help you navigate a crisis and hopefully ensure that your brand doesn't suffer too negative an experience from what you've what you and your passengers have gone through. But I'll touch a bit more on best practice with crises later on. It's a really big subject and one which is easy to overlook in favour of getting the business up and running. But obviously you're aware anything can happen anywhere in the world. Terror attacks in Europe, Africa, overseas, India, etc. They could hit at any point without warning, and you just need to ensure that you're giving yourselves the best opportunity to not just look after your customers, but to protect your brand and also to continue trading. It's no good having the entire company tied up in one crisis. And you still need to sell holidays, you still need to look after other customers. So it's a really important area of risk concern, and one which we can certainly provide insurance assistance to help you with, and certainly one which every company should factor into their risk protocols. So moving on to the next slide, I just want to touch upon the importance of experienced advisors. And here I stress I'm not just talking about ourselves. There are others in the market who do exactly what we do. We all know each other. We all do exactly the same thing. So the importance of having an experienced advisor in terms of your travel business can't be understated. As an industry, the travel sector is probably more exposed to risk and variety of risk than most. And what's important to have is someone looking after your insurances who understands A, what you're going through, and B, particularly the exposures you face. That's massively important. It's also important, as I say, we've looked earlier at what's vital to have in place as an insurance, as a travel business from the outset. But as you grow as a company, so too grow your exposures to risk and the variety of risks you face. So it's also important to keep on top of what insurance you have in place and what you can add to that portfolio as your cash flow and your risk profile dictates. So very important there. Risk management, we touched upon crises, and I suppose the sister subject to that is on the next slide, the importance of having a really good risk management protocol in place. And the best time to start this is when your business starts as well. You may potentially have a smaller number of tours and destinations to manage. And the importance of getting a really good quality risk management policy up and running internally can't be understated, because that can evolve and grow with you as you grow there. So what is risk management? Well, it's a vital risk mitigation tool. You've got your liability insurance that will pick up claims, but having good attention to detail in terms of supplier selection, risk management, and crisis management as well can help to reduce the risks, or certainly the severity of risks should they occur. So if you can reduce the impact of claims on your insurances, that could hopefully have a positive impact on your premium. And you may potentially look at slightly cheaper premiums if you can demonstrate that you have risk management and risk awareness at the heart of your business. Insurers will look at these positively. And as I've said before, in the event of a serious incident, a really good quality risk management program can potentially limit your exposure to risk and severity to risk as well. And it does give you peace of mind, not just for you, but also for your clients. Again, coming back to certain types of clients, education industries, for example, the education sector rather, they may be looking to you to provide confirmation of your risk management. So, are you a safe company to travel with? Do we want to send our students with you? If you can come up with a document which says, yes, we know what we're doing, we've done our research, we've looked at everything in resort, we've got trusted working partners, we've looked them up and they've got all the appropriate licenses, that gives you the best chance to secure potential new business from other areas as well. We do a lot of work on risk management. We've got our own risk management guide for tour operators. If anyone's got any particular questions on what they should be looking for, what to focus on, we'd be more than happy to send you our free guide. It goes into a lot more detail than I'm able to do in the timescale I've got today, but hopefully we'll give you some good focus there. And if you've got any questions, we'll be delighted to see what additional help we can provide you. So next slides. I'm going to give you 2 slides of what I consider to be best practice hints and tips for startups and new businesses. This is born out of 20 years of seeing how things work really, really well, and also seeing how things don't necessarily work so well. So, as I've already mentioned, have a really good risk management program in place. It's good relationships with your suppliers are absolutely essential. Things won't always go smoothly. Suppliers won't always turn up when they're supposed to. Hotels will be double booked, as will flights. So having a really good relationship with your supplier and knowing your suppliers inside out gives you the best opportunity to nip issues in the bud when they occur, hopefully with a minimum of fuss and minimum cost. And here, as has been mentioned earlier, having really good, robust contracts in place, drawn up by a travel industry lawyer, it's a good one on this, an excellent one on this seminar, will give you excellent protection here as well. So do pay attention to your contracts. If you can choose suppliers who've got their own public liability insurance in place as well and can demonstrate that, again, that's a really good step, because you're liable for a hell of a lot, and your liability insurance policy will pick up the tab for a huge variety of claims. But if we're able to involve the insurers of a hotel, for example, or a transportation supplier, and hopefully pass the claim ultimately up the chain to them as they were potentially the negligent party, that will potentially wipe that claim off of your record and can have a really positive impact on your premiums and obviously your policy cover going forward. Quality control is essential. Again, coming back to knowing your suppliers, make sure you know that what you're offering for sale actually matches what in reality is happening on the ground. So a hotel can say, yeah, we've got 4 stories, they're all suites, all en suite, fantastic 5-star quality. If they get there to find that it's 2-star quality and shared bathrooms, you're going to get some really upset customers, which will lead to claims against you. So obviously it's not always possible to check hotels personally on a regular basis, but do check up on suppliers. Do make sure that what they're offering is accurate and matches what your customers are paying for. Because ultimately, when a customer books with you, they will form reasonable expectations of what they're going to get for their money. Ultimately, if they don't get what they feel they paid for, then the chances are a claim comes your way after the holiday, and you're looking at obviously your insurance policy having to pay out for refunds and claims from there. And here, customer feedback is absolutely key. It's a really important factor in risk management. So, you've done all your research, you've got your hotel chains that you use, you know your suppliers. But if a customer comes back and says, you know what, that was a really poor customer experience, the facilities were old and tired and dated, things didn't work, there were loose wires hanging out the ceiling, this does happen. Act on that. Speak to the supplier, see if they can address these things, because if you're aware that a hotel is potentially a little bit substandard and you continue to send customers there, you're not giving yourself a leg to stand on should a claim come in. So it's a really good defense mechanism, and also a customer experience mechanism as well. Similarly, with transportation suppliers, they will be insured in their own right. That's fine, and that's legal. But if you, as an individual, particularly here, we're looking at potential European holidays as a small business to help out and cut costs. If you're picking passengers up from airports or taking them to hotels in your own car, something that's always overlooked, make sure that you, as an individual, have added business class onto your own personal motor insurance policy. If you don't, and you have an accident, you could end up with your policy cover being invalidated. It's not something we do here. We don't do with motor insurance particularly, but just a little hint and tip from me. Make sure if you're using your own car that you've got appropriate business class use with it. One key element, which again is occasionally overlooked, if you become aware of any incident which could at some point in the future, it doesn't have to be next week or even next month, but if you're aware that a passenger has suffered an injury, make sure you tell your insurance company immediately, because if you don't, and 3 years down the line, you get court papers in to claim for a serious back injury that's gradually deteriorated over the years, you could potentially be looking at a serious claim, which may potentially not necessarily be insured if you hadn't reported it at the time. So that's a key element. And last page of hints and tips. Again, we've said having an insurance advisor who's a specialist in the travel sector is really important for you guys, and say there are a number of us around. Please use them, because that could be worth its weight in gold. Tour operator liability insurance is not available online. You can go online, buy a policy which says yes, business description, travel agent, tour operator. Great, I've got public liability there, no problem. That will not give you the protection you need. What you'll be buying there is an office policy, which is great for what it does. It protects your office. But as a tour operator, you need a specialist level of liability cover to meet the worldwide exposures to risk that you face. So please be wary. If a policy says it's only going to be 50 quid or 100 quid, the chances are it's possibly not the right one for you. Do speak to professional advisors and get an opinion on it, just to make sure that what you are purchasing is fit for purpose. So that's a really important thing. Do look at expanding your portfolio of insurances as you grow as a company. Risk exposures change regularly, and certain insurance policies which may potentially have been contingent in nature previously may become more important and more prevalent as businesses develop and grow. Cyber insurance obviously being a really important example there. Robust terms and conditions, supplier contracts, these are massively important. If you get them right from the outset, it's money well spent and absolutely essential. Similarly, employment contracts as well. Don't leave things to chance. If you haven't got employment contracts in place and something happens, this is your best chance for defence. And really, whilst everyone hopes that as a company you're never going to have a crisis, and I really hope you don't, it's essential to plan for one, because if it happens, you need to know exactly what to do. Have a team who know exactly what their tasks are and their roles. Test, make sure your plans work. Involve your insurance advisors, speak to your crisis providers, make sure that if something happens, you as a company are ready to roll in, look after your customers' interests, protect your brand, and get testing from there. So we're more than happy to provide assistance and advice where we can for that. It's a really important thing to have done. Test it regularly. If you don't, chances are things will get rusty, and if you have a major incident, no one's going to know what to do. So really essential there. So how can we help you? We are experienced. We've got a large client base. There's not much we haven't insured, although we do still get on a fairly regular basis unusual and new companies coming in doing different things. We will look at everything with a balanced view, and where possible, if we can insure you, we certainly will look to provide terms. We actually have our own liability insurance scheme, which has been successfully operating for many, many years, and that will continue to grow and expand as we go. We also, in addition to that, have our own bespoke 24/7 crisis response service, which is run in conjunction with a long-standing client of ours and provides a range of crisis experts. Risk management advice is key for us. We don't just want to give you your insurance policy and leave it at that. If we can help you with risk management, we certainly will, particularly if you're looking at running new tours to areas you've never been to before. Yeah, we're happy to see if we can offer advice, or certainly put you in touch with people that can. Yeah, as we said, you've got a wide variety of insurance policies that you could consider. We do offer a wide variety here, and are happy to advise on whether or not something is essential now, or whether or not something could be considered at a more appropriate time. And most importantly, we have, unfortunately, in 20 years, seen most types of claim scenarios, from minor to major. We do understand the potential risks you face, as do our peers, and that's the key thing. If you can speak to someone who's been there, seen it, and gone through it, then you will have an understanding of the right types of insurance to look for, and why they are the costs they are, etc. That is a really brief whistle-stop tour of that liability insurance. I could go on for hours. I won't. You can escape that particular pleasure. But if anyone's got any questions, I've been more than happy to help and assist, and contact you personally after the event if necessary. So thank you very much. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you, Alan. And certainly there are a couple of questions lining up, at least one of which I'm sure will be coming in your direction. We are running slightly over where we wanted to be, but coming up next, a very special treat as far as I'm concerned. We said at the very start of today that we at Travelaw, and I know that this is replicated throughout TTC and also at Travel Risk Professionals as well, that we'd seen quite an increase in the amount of people looking to get into travel, which on the face of it, we were slightly surprised about, because with the pandemic happening and with travel looking, certainly in the early days, well, we didn't really know what was happening, did we? We didn't know what the future held, but it certainly looked pretty grim at times. Nevertheless, we've seen a lot of this. So we are absolutely delighted here today to have someone who has been through this journey. So Emily, could you unmute yourself? Emily Woolard, good morning, Emily.
Morning.
Is one of the directors at the Tartan Road. I will let Emily describe her journey as to how she's got here. But this next session is just a bit of it's a fireside chat, but as with all fireside chats, there's no fire. It's all a bit strange, but just a bit of a Q&A, really, a conversation between me and Emily. And let me start off with my tongue firmly in my cheek, knowing the timelines that I know in terms of when the Tartan Road really got going. That was very much at the start of the pandemic, or around that time. What on earth were you thinking, Emily?
It's a fair question, and it's definitely one that I've asked myself quite a few times over the last year. First of all, thanks for having me, Matt, and thank you very much for the session, although I probably shouldn't admit it, having been in the industry for a year now. I've learned quite a lot this morning, so thank you for that. So what was I thinking? I moved to a rural area of Scotland about 5 years ago, and I had a long-term goal of running my own business, particularly seeing issues with depopulation. I wanted to be able to support myself, but also ideally create flexible and non-seasonal jobs locally, because that's something that's really needed. I saw an opportunity to serve high net worth customers with bespoke tours, because partly my career background is in financial services. So I was used to looking after those kind of clients in that market, although was completely new to the travel sector. So it's been a little bit of a baptism of fire. And you were saying there's no fire, but actually I think there might be. So I'd put the business plan together for the Tartan Road over the course of a couple of years. And like a lot of people in the situation, I was waiting for the right moment. I can tell you exactly when the right moment wasn't, and that was the start of the pandemic. But I actually was given a little shove into it. I lost my job at the start of the pandemic, and I had quite a short window in which to decide whether I would take on another job or whether I would try to put this business plan that I'd been planning into action. So I did decide to go for it, and obviously I knew it wouldn't be an easy first year, but I did, and I do see opportunity in the recovery. And I thought that COVID might accelerate the move towards a sort of more upmarket, single vehicle, single household method of small group travel, and away from larger groups, unfortunately, which we have seen happening. So I'm still optimistic, although the length of time it's been going on for obviously is not something that anyone could have predicted.
Quite. And, you know, really, given everything we've talked about today, you ran that whole gamut, didn't you, in terms of resolving and working through everything, the regulatory, the financial, the insurance. Tell us a bit about that. What bits did you find easier? What bits did you find harder? What was that whole experience like?
So I think financial services was probably good preparation in that I came from a heavily regulated industry, and I can understand it would be quite scary coming into an industry like travel if you've not had that experience of having to comply with quite complex regulation and having a regulator that's sort of looking over your shoulder all the time. Obviously, the first thing to do was get my head around the package travel regulations, and because I was going to be selling accommodation activities and experiences together, so very much within the scope of that legislation. And really from the start, until you understand your obligations, you can't really move forward with a business plan. You can't really understand how the financials are going to work without that basic knowledge of the legal requirements. So that was important. And I talked to actually Emma at Travelor quite early on about the booking conditions and what we needed to say in those. Had this nice idea that I'd write a supplier agreement and everyone would just accept it. But obviously, as a small startup operating with large chain hotels in some cases, I had to just fit in with their existing procedures. It wasn't possible to come to them and say, this is my agreement, this is what you're going to accept. So I had to be flexible in that. But booking conditions are obviously essential to define my relationship with the customer and make sure they complied with the regulations. As Matt's mentioned, and a couple of you others as well, we had to have a bond in place where we had to have financial protection against insolvency as part of the compliance with the regulations. And we had that arranged through Abtot, who were extremely helpful. But again, as Matt mentioned earlier, there's theoretically various options, but depending on appetite and what the market's doing at the time, some of those are not available. So we actually had to go down the route of arranging a bond because the appetite of insurance underwriters during the pandemic was just pretty much nil. So it was more to pay up front, but overall less expensive. And I think we're happy with the outcome. It's just that it was quite an involved process to get there. And being a tour operator, we had the joy of tour operators VAT as well. So that was quite an interesting thing to get our heads around from an accounting perspective. And even with financial services background and knowledge, I still found that complicated. So I've needed good professional advice throughout.
Yeah, and I think anyone who's been through the journey that you have, and that's going to include many of the people on this call who, that are at different stages of all this side of thing. Do not underestimate the job that you are doing is a difficult one because there is so much in terms of regulation and compliance. Every industry talks about it, but I think in travel there is a lot because we're dealing with people's dreams. And dealing with consumer money, which not every industry can say. Fortunately, we have many good advisors that can help with that. So you've already talked, Emma. I was going to ask you about were there any particular challenges that kind of stood out to you? But I think you by all means add to it. But I think you've more or less covered that off. So let's turn to the other side of things. You've established a great company there, and you're now looking to take advantage, as you say, of the opening up of travel, and it is happening. So are there any particular tips or strategies or thoughts that you can kind of share with the group? No company secrets needed, but just general tips that might help other people as they kind of look at that same journey that you have.
Yeah, no problem. I think obviously the main challenge has been COVID, and that we've had a couple of false starts with having to cancel our January bookings when we thought things might be getting up and running again, obviously back into lockdown at the end of last year. And then we've also had another sort of issue last week with Glasgow remaining in a higher tier of restrictions than the rest of Scotland. So I suppose that leads me to say just have a plan B always, and make sure that you game through in your head all the different scenarios that could happen. I think I'm a bit of a worrier, so it's probably I can usually think of worse things than will ever arise, but actually during the pandemic I don't think that's been the case. So it's been useful for risk management to just think through what could go wrong and how would I handle it. I've touched on, I think, the need for good professional advisors, because as an entrepreneur trying to run a business initially on your own or with a very small team, you can't possibly hope to be expert in the range of things that you need to know about in order to do that well. So you do need good advisors from the early stages, and obviously to help you figure out what you need to do and how to navigate it, and to deal with those specialist areas that you don't necessarily know in enough depth yourself. I think we learned actually through the merchant acquirer process, Matt also touched on this earlier, that cheapest solution is not always the best. So we signed up with, I guess, just an option that we thought was cheap and easy. And they very quickly in the pandemic designated the entire travel sector as high risk, and they were closing down accounts and moving the goalposts around rolling reserves. And they were basically just making it clear they didn't really want to deal with our industry under the current circumstances. So we were in a situation where we thought we had a solution and could take card payments and everything was kind of up and running, and then very quickly found that that wasn't going to be something that was reliable enough to actually run the business with. So we've had to pay a bit more and go with a specialist provider that's used to dealing with the travel industry and is a bit more nuanced. But I think just having that peace of mind that they're not going to dump us at the first sign of trouble, and they're not going to regard the whole industry as high risk, they'll be a bit more careful and kind of case by case about how they look at businesses. And I think also professional associations are something that I maybe didn't recognize the value of, but when rules were changing constantly and businesses were maybe affected in a way that wasn't envisaged or wasn't intended, being part of an industry association, being able to lobby as a group was really helpful, because that got the message across much clearer to those that were changing and making the rules. And I think our professional associations have done a really good job of representing the industry during what's been a really difficult time. So it's not something that I would have necessarily considered paying for in the past, but I think that I would now see the value of that. Otherwise, I guess good mentors have been useful. I didn't know the travel industry at all, so speaking to people with prior experience has been really helpful and just helping me get up and running.
Well, we talk about that year after year, time after time, that the travel industry is one big family, really. And yes, there are lots of competitors for particular businesses around, on this call, but at the end of the day, we're all pulling in the same direction largely, certainly at the moment. And it's good to hear that so many businesses, and I know this is true of Tartan Road, have got a very positive outlook going forward. So look, we really value that insight and that input, Emily. Thank you, and all the best to you and the business going forward. And I know, because you told me yesterday that you like putting the business to one side, the many books behind you include a number of travel books, which are absolutely dying to actually try out and be able to utilize. And I think we all share that desire.
Yeah. Thanks very much for having me.
Pleasure, Emily, pleasure. Okay, and so that brings us to the last few minutes where we can take any questions that you may have. There's a couple that's come in, so I'll start with those. If you do have a question, I think probably the easiest way to do that is if you use the reactions button down the bottom and put your hand up, then I can come to you, or type it in the chat. We'll go through the questions that we've had first. One that came in actually just after you were speaking, Ami, so it's come to me. And the gist of the question is this, which is, do I need, in capital letters, employment contracts, or can a business survive without them?
What you will need is from day one of employment, what we call terms and conditions. So they are your basic things: how much pay, what the place of work is, the hours, the holidays. But by the time you've done that, you've got the large bulk of what we would put into a contract anyway. The additional things that you would put into a contract are things like restrictive covenants, covering off confidentiality, intellectual property, all the things that are going to protect your business. So as an employment lawyer, I would say, yes, you do need contracts of employment over and above terms and conditions of employment. Okay, there we go. A good answer to a good question. And we know it's difficult as a startup with the many demands that are on you as a business, the many things that you're being asked to kind of like get into place. But they are, for all the reasons we've heard, very, very important. Again, I'm kind of paraphrasing this question, but it's a question that anybody can answer. But I think that Matt and Adam at TTC, this probably sits better with you. And the general question is, what are we looking at in terms of an outlook for travel?
we're still currently in the grips of traffic lights and FCDO advice, but what are you expecting to see going forward? Are we going to get to the stage where we used to be, or is that time gone forever?
I'll let Adam come in a minute as well. I think what we're seeing so far with clients, I think we all expected, or we all hoped, that there would be this this wider green list, and there would be this clamber for people booking holidays. And obviously the green list was underwhelming to say the least. And so there have been bookings. As I understand it, there've even been bookings for amber countries, maybe not for immediate departures, but more in the summer. So I think there is still some optimism around there. I think that we're all sort of bated breath waiting for the next green list to be pushed out. I think, for me, as long as what countries are moving forward, so going from red to amber and amber to green, and no one is moving backwards, then I think I think that gives people more confidence to book. And I think ultimately we will end up to where we were before. I think the desire to travel is still very much there. It's just taking far longer than any of us hoped. But Adam, I don't know if you want to comment on some of the other things we're seeing from clients.
Yeah, we talk about consumer sentiment, and obviously we manage a number of clients and act as finance director for a number of businesses, including startups. So we get to see a wealth of data, and when we start to look at that, what are people booking, where are they booking, and when are they traveling? I think, to answer the question in short, the long term has got very good prospects. We've seen kind of small bursts of that, but really it's clarity and confidence, really. And I think the clarity for the consumer will drive the confidence and increase the bookings. And we just haven't had that clarity, have we? It's been very confusing in terms of the messaging that comes across from government and what you can and can't do. And I think in the short term, while that still exists, we'll still see, fits and starts, and that plays into the startup. Really, if you are just getting going or thinking about that, then you really need to scenario plan, as existing businesses are, because it's not going to be straightforward at all. So in short, I think short term very challenging, but long term, medium long term, will return to previous levels at least, I would have thought.
Good. Thank you both. There's a question that's come in from Colin, which I will tackle in a second. It's quite a big question, but that's fine. We like the hard questions. Again, I'm paraphrasing here a question that's come in privately. Amanda, I think this is probably fits your session best. Basically saying we are struggling to get suppliers to sign our own supplier agreements. What can we do in that scenario? What do you do if you have your own supplier agreement as a business, but you can't get your suppliers to sign it and they shove theirs under your nose? What's the kind of general lay of the land there?
Not ideal, is it? But it does happen, unfortunately. I think the key thing is really to understand what your supplier agreement does for you and what the key terms are that are within that. You do find that some suppliers want to contract on their own terms, but most are at least flexible in some respect as to kind of negotiating that document. And so I think you need to know your supply agreement well and know what you want from it that you want to insert into theirs as a result. So things like the indemnity that I was talking about, if you can get that in there in some form, getting things around compliance with laws, insurance. It really depends on what's in their document at the moment. If it's just kind of like a rate sheet, which they sometimes are, then that's really not great. But yeah, it's kind of just trying to work with them and negotiate their document, and also have a look at what laws they're subject to as well. It's not something I covered in my talk, but you want to have it subject to English law if possible. It's always a very difficult one, but it means that if someone does bring a claim against you as a result of the supplier's actions, then if you've got your contract subject to English law, then there's a chance that you can actually join them into the action in the UK, and they have to then kind of the defendants as well, rather than without that, if it's subject to their own whatever country they're in, then you have to kind of stand with the defendant there and then try and recover from them in whatever country they're based in, and it's very difficult. So look at your laws as a priority and look at your key terms and see if you can kind of get those into their contract, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a litigation lawyer by trade or by history, so important to get the jurisdiction clause in, and it makes all the difference. And I know Alan and the various insurers that he represents, his advice would be the same, I'm sure. Get it if you can, not the easiest question. Okay, coming back to your question, Colin. Colin's question is in the chat, and it's largely about, what do we do where we have a situation where we are I think what you're saying, Colin, is that you're potentially sending people with, potentially mobility issues or other issues that might be classified under the Equality Act here in the UK. And you describe a situation where, able-bodied guests are swarming over resort hotel sun terraces, and, does that leave you as a business potentially exposed? I mean, that's a very specific question with a very kind of big set of answers that can go in any number of directions. What I would say on that is, largely the starting point here is the Equality Act, and whether you as a business are potentially discriminating either directly or indirectly against those customers. There are protected characteristics under the Equality Act. It lists what they are, it lists what the kinds of discrimination is. That's a very difficult situation to unpick in such a short space of time, because there are so many issues with it. But that doesn't sound to me like you are discriminating as such. It just sounds like the situation which is happening. But again, it then gives you pause for thought about how you deliver those holidays, especially going forward when you've been made aware of an issue. So I don't know whether that helps or not. I'm also not sure what the UN CRPD 2008 is. Maybe I should. Anyone else going to help me out with that? No? Okay, good. Makes me feel a little bit better. Alan knows what it is. No one knows, do we?
No chance.
No chance, no. But again, thinking about all the things we've just said with Amanda and whatnot just now, you're looking at supplier contracts and whether they're important, and making sure that your suppliers have got things under control. So much to talk about there, so much there. Okay, and another question from Eli. Emma, I don't know if you want to have a crack at this one, what the general situation is with the pandemic and cancellations, and who should be giving refunds. I know when we've been talking to people, Emma, a lot recently, we've been kind of really putting the focus on FCDO advice and the importance of.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite very, very topical at the moment, but I think, again, yeah, it depends on the particular circumstances. So it depends really on when the booking is due to go ahead, the travel is due to go ahead, at what stage that will take place, and also the reason for the cancellation, whether that comes because the holiday cannot go ahead because there's an issue in destination, or whether it is a disinclination to travel. So there's a few different issues there, and it would depend, I think, on the particular facts.
Quite so. Okay, well, we set this webinar to go on until 11:30. It's now 20 to 12, so I think we will probably bring the proceedings to a close there. If there are any questions, Colin, I know you've just flagged up that particular convention. I'd be happy to talk to you about that after this offline. Send me an email or pick up with us, and we'll happily talk about that, because it's a subject and an issue that's close to our heart in terms of being able to try and resolve those kinds of things. So happy to do that. And if anyone else has any other questions that flow as a result of this, please do feel free. Maybe submit them to Traveller, and we can pass them on to Alan at Travel Risk Professionals if needed, and to Matt and Adam at TTC if needed. And again, we can pick up anything here at Traveller otherwise. So thank you all for watching. I'm left only to thank all our speakers today, Emma, Ami, Amanda, Matt, Adam and Alan, and Emily, of course. We got a lot of experts and a lot of talent and a lot of knowledge in such a short space of time. So I hope you have found it useful. That's ultimately the test, as we always say. Please let us know if you did. Please let us know if you didn't. We're happy to have feedback. And enjoy yourselves. Get back to sending people where we want them to be, and keep yourselves safe. Thank you very much to everybody. Take care.